It is the evening of December the 16th, 1985. The streets of Midtown Manhattan are busy with the ordinary noise of a Monday night in December. Cabs pulling to the curb, people moving in and out of restaurants, the low, persistent hum of a city that does not slow down for winter. On East 46th Street, near 3rd Avenue, a car pulls up outside a well-known steakhouse. Two men step out. One of them is heavyset, wearing a tan coat. His name is Paul Castellano. He is 68 years old and the acknowledged head of what federal investigators consider the most powerful organized crime family in the United States. He does not make it to the door. Three men in trench coats and fur hats emerge from the nearby crowd and move toward him with deliberate speed. Within seconds, both Castellano and the man walking beside him, his newly appointed underboss Thomas Bilotti, have been shot multiple times and are lying on the pavement outside the restaurant. The gunmen walk away without panic. The street erupts into confusion. A dark sedan moves slowly through the traffic nearby, the driver leaning slightly to observe the scene. Then it disappears into the flow of the city. No one in that car is ever arrested for what just happened. The man believed to have been sitting in that sedan, watching, confirming, is 45 years old from Queens. A lifelong criminal who has spent years working in the shadows of this same organization that Castellano once ran. His name is John Gotti. And in the weeks that follow, he will be recognized as the new head of the Gambino crime family. What follows is neither a celebration of what he did, nor a condemnation of it. It is instead an attempt to understand how a boy born in a Bronx tenement in 1940 arrived at that street corner in Manhattan 4.5 decades later, and what it cost him, and the organization he briefly ran to get there. To understand John Gotti, it is necessary to understand the organization that shaped so much of the city he grew up in. The Italian-American mafia, known internally as Cosa Nostra, meaning roughly our thing, had been a presence in the northeastern United States since the late 19th century. Its roots lay in the mass migration of Italians, many of them from Sicily and the south of the peninsula, who arrived in American cities in enormous numbers between roughly 1880 and 1920. Criminal networks that had existed in Europe found ready conditions in cities like New York and Chicago. Prohibition transformed them. The federal ban on the sale of alcohol, which lasted from 1920 to 1933, created an illegal economy almost overnight, and the organizations already in place were positioned to supply what the law had forbidden. By the time Prohibition ended, the scaffolding of what would become the modern American mafia was in place across dozens of cities. In 1931, following a period of violent internal conflict, the heads of the major families met and agreed to a governing framework. A body called the Commission was established, comprised of the most powerful bosses, charged with overseeing spheres of influence and mediating disputes. In New York, 5 families would divide the city among themselves, each controlling distinct activities and territories. One of those 5 families would eventually bear the name of Carlo Gambino, a Sicilian immigrant who had arrived in the United States in 1921. Gambino was, by most measures, the most durable figure in the history of American organized crime. He survived the deaths of multiple bosses, shifted through changes in leadership with remarkable instinct, and largely avoided the attention of federal investigators for nearly 5 decades. In 1957, after his predecessor Albert Anastasia was killed, Gambino took control of one of the most powerful families in New York. By the late 1950s, when a teenager named John Gotti began making himself useful to men connected to that organization in Brooklyn, the Gambino family was operating near the summit of organized crime in New York. It was also beginning to attract the sustained attention of a federal government that had grown increasingly aware of what it was dealing with and increasingly determined to act. John Joseph Gotti Jr. was born on October 27, 1940, in the Bronx, the 5th of what would eventually become 13 children born to John Gotti Sr. and his wife Philomena, known to the family as Fanny. The family had roots near Naples, in southern Italy, though Gotti would insist in later years that his father had been born in New Jersey. The family's circumstances were uncertain. Gotti would describe his childhood as one of genuine poverty, and spoke about his father with barely concealed contempt, referring to him on more than one occasion as, in his own words, a bum. The fuller picture is somewhat more nuanced. John Sr. did work, taking on various jobs, but a gambling problem meant that what he earned rarely translated into household stability. The children grew up knowing the difference between what they had and what other families seemed to have. In the early 1950s, the family moved to Brooklyn, and it was there that the direction of Gotti's life began to take shape. By 13, he was running errands for men who were known in the neighborhood to be connected. By 14 or 15, he was skipping school regularly. A test placed his IQ at around 110. He would later claim a much higher figure. What he had, those who knew him agreed, was a particular kind of intelligence, practical, social, and acutely attuned to how people could be read and used. An incident from these years left a permanent physical mark. Gotti was part of a group attempting to steal a portable cement mixer when it toppled and crushed the front of his foot. The damage was lasting. The nerve injury affected how he walked for the rest of his life. He compensated by developing a deliberate, controlled stride that, to observers, looked less like a limp and more like the walk of someone who had decided exactly how they wanted to move through the world. By the late 1950s, Gotti had consolidated around a group of young men who had grown up in the same Brooklyn streets. The group was loosely known as the Fulton Rockaway Boys. Among them was Angelo Ruggiero, who would remain at his side for decades, and Wilfred Johnson, known as Willie Boy, whose position in the group was complicated by his mixed heritage, including Native American ancestry, which barred him from full initiation into the organization. That complication would have serious consequences for Gotti later. The local Gambino figure who formalized the relationship was Carmine Fatico, a senior capo. Between 1957 and 1961, Gotti was arrested 5 times on minor charges, avoiding significant jail time on each occasion. In August 1960, a relationship with a young woman named Victoria Di Giorgio, of Italian and Russian Jewish descent, produced an unplanned pregnancy. Their daughter Angela was born in April 1961. They married in March 1962. For a time, under Victoria's influence, Gotti tried legitimate employment. Delivery work, factory jobs, none of it held. The gap between what those jobs offered and what he had seen men earn through crime was too wide. By the mid-1960s, with more children and a series of separations behind them, he returned to criminal activity full-time. Victoria accepted this, or ceased to challenge it once the money came reliably. The circumstances that allowed Gotti's criminal career to properly accelerate in the mid-1960s were partly the result of geography. Carmine Fatico, his mentor, decided to relocate his operations from East New York to the borough of Queens. The demographic makeup of the old neighborhood was changing rapidly, as new communities of immigrants from other parts of the world replaced the Italian-American identity that had once characterized those streets. Fatico established new operations in Ozone Park, a neighborhood in Queens situated not far from the airport that had recently been renamed John F. Kennedy International Airport. The location was not incidental. JFK was, by the mid-1960s, one of the busiest cargo airports in the world. Hundreds of trucks moved through the area every day, carrying goods of every description from the airport terminals toward Manhattan and the rest of the metropolitan area. The opportunity was obvious to anyone looking for it, and Gotti and his crew were looking. From 1966 onward, Gotti and the men around him, Ruggiero, Willie Boy Johnson, and several of his brothers, including Peter, Richard, and Gene, began systematically hijacking cargo trucks operating in and around the airport. The operation was often aided by insiders, workers at the airport who knew which trucks were carrying the most valuable cargo, or which shipments contained large amounts of cash. The method was relatively straightforward. A truck would be identified. A crew would intercept it. The goods would be taken, redistributed, and sold. This was, in the mid to late 1960s, a period in which law enforcement had not yet fully organized to address the scale of what was happening. The volume of cargo moving through American airports had grown rapidly, and the criminal networks exploiting that volume had outpaced the institutional response. It was, in the language of those involved, the Wild West, and Gotti and his crew operated accordingly. The arrests, when they came, were perhaps inevitable. In 1968, Gotti and several associates were picked up after the FBI observed them posing as truckers, driving a rented vehicle into the JFK cargo area in an attempt to steal a shipment of women's clothing. It was hardly the most glamorous of operations, but it was the one that got them caught. They were released on bail. The following year, before the first case had been resolved, Gotti and Ruggiero were arrested again, this time for hijacking a truck carrying cigarettes worth tens of thousands of dollars. The judge, noting that they had been arrested for a second offense while out on bail for the first, sentenced both men to 3 years in federal prison. Gotti served his sentence at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania between 1969 and 1972. He was released somewhat earlier than the full term, owing to legal irregularities in how some of the evidence against him had been gathered. Even so, he was 29 years old when he entered Lewisburg and 31 when he came out. He had spent nearly a third of his adult years either in custody or awaiting trial. None of this appeared to alter his direction. Gotti returned to New York in 1972 and resumed his activities with minimal delay. The city he came back to was not entirely the same one he had left. The early 1970s in New York were a period of significant social disorder, rising violent crime, fiscal instability, and a general loosening of civic constraint that created both danger and opportunity for the men operating outside the law. The opportunity that most directly shaped Gotti's standing in the Gambino family came in 1973, and it arrived in the form of a problem. A group of criminals operating in New York under the leadership of a man named James McBratney had been running a kidnapping operation targeting members of organized crime families. By late 1972 and into 1973, the operation had escalated. Members of the Gambino and Lucchese families were being abducted and held for ransom. One of those targeted was Emmanuel Gambino, a nephew of Carlo Gambino's. The kidnapping went badly, and Gambino was killed. This was not a situation Carlo Gambino could ignore, and he did not. Gotti and Angelo Ruggiero were among those selected to deal with McBratney. The reasoning was practical. Having spent years in prison, they would not be easily recognized by McBratney or those around him. A third man, Ralph Gallioni, was also recruited. On the 22nd of May 1973, the three men entered a bar and grill on Staten Island, presented themselves as detectives, and attempted to remove McBratney on the pretext of an arrest. The scene became chaotic. McBratney resisted. Before it was over, he had been shot dead inside the establishment. The action earned Gotti recognition from Carlo Gambino and the broader leadership of the family, but it had been conducted in a very public setting, before numerous witnesses. The consequences were predictable. A photo array presented to witnesses eventually identified Ralph Gallioni. Gotti and Ruggiero, it is believed, killed Gallioni in December 1973 before he could talk, but what they had not accounted for was Willie Boy Johnson. Johnson had, over the previous several years, developed a relationship with law enforcement. His position within the mafia had always been complicated by the fact that his partial Native American heritage meant he could not become a fully initiated member of the organization, could not, in the language used within Cosa Nostra, be made, excluded from full membership by a rule he had no power to change. Johnson had begun providing information to police as a way of protecting himself. He provided them with details connecting Gotti to the McBratney killing. When Gotti learned that police were actively looking for him, he went into hiding. He spent the better part of 6 months moving between safe houses and borrowed apartments across New York. Acting on a tip, almost certainly from Johnson again, the NYPD located Gotti in a bar in Queens in the spring of 1974 and arrested him. What followed was one of the more remarkable legal outcomes of Gotti's early career. He was facing charges connected to a homicide. His defense attorney was Roy Cohn, a figure of significant notoriety who had made his name as counsel to Senator Joseph McCarthy during the anti-communist investigations of the early 1950s and had since become one of the most sought-after and controversial lawyers in New York. Through Cohn's negotiations with the prosecution, the case was ultimately resolved with a plea arrangement. Gotti received a sentence of 4 years. He served fewer than 3. He would walk out of prison in the summer of 1977. The man who had arranged his plea deal, Roy Cohn, would be disbarred years later for unethical conduct. The world Gotti returned to had changed, but not in ways that made his path less clear. The mid-1970s brought a transition within the Gambino family that would ultimately define the second half of Gotti's life. On October 15, 1976, Carlo Gambino died at his home in Staten Island following a heart attack. He was 74 years old. Gambino had run the family with patience and a kind of institutional intelligence that made him almost uniquely difficult for law enforcement to touch. For years, the expectation within the family had been that his underboss, Aniello Della Croce, would succeed him. Della Croce was a respected figure in the old-school tradition, tough, experienced, and deeply connected to the street-level membership of the organization. Gambino had other ideas. His choice of successor was Paul Castellano, his own brother-in-law, a man whose vision for the family ran in a different direction. Castellano was a businessman by inclination, someone who preferred white-collar enterprise and legal or semi-legal operations to the street-level violence and drug trafficking that had long been the lifeblood of the organization. He had articulated over the years a version of what the Gambino family should become: more insulated from prosecution, less exposed to the risks of narcotics charges, more like a corporation than a gang. Della Croce accepted the succession. He had, after all, been in prison on tax evasion charges for much of the period when Gambino's health was failing, and he understood that the time was not right for a challenge. But the decision planted a fault line through the middle of the organization between those who aligned themselves with Castellano's more detached, corporate approach and those who found themselves drawn to a different kind of leadership. Gotti, released from prison in 1977, found himself on one side of that line almost immediately and not Castellano's side. What facilitated his rise in those years was also the result of a change in his immediate hierarchy. Carmine Fatico, the capo who had first recruited Gotti and mentored him through the early years, had been arrested while Gotti was in prison, charged in connection with the theft of approximately $3 million from a cargo shipment at JFK Airport. Fatico took a plea deal in 1976 and received a 5-year sentence. With Fatico removed, there was an opening, and Gotti stepped into it. He was now a caporegime, in the formal terminology, a captain within the Gambino hierarchy responsible for overseeing a crew. He ran his operations out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park. On paper, for the purposes of his parole obligations, he was employed as a plumber. The details of that particular arrangement were, in later years, recalled with some embarrassment by the official who had signed off on his paperwork. Also around this period, Gambino's decision to formally open the organization to new initiates, something he had held back for years, meant that Gotti was among those made as a full member of Cosa Nostra. His time in prison and his role in the McBratney killing were recognized as service. He was now a made man. He was 37 years old. He had spent nearly a decade in and out of prison, and he had just been handed the most significant promotion of his life. Late 1978 brought two incidents, largely separate in their origins, but close together in time, that illustrated both the nature of the criminal world Gotti inhabited and the particular dangers that came with it. The first was the Lufthansa heist. In December of 1978, a team of criminals organized primarily by a man named James Burke, known informally as Jimmy the Gent, executed a robbery at the Lufthansa cargo terminal at JFK Airport. The operation, months in the planning, relied on inside knowledge of the terminal's layout and the location of a large quantity of currency being stored there. The crew entered the facility, secured the staff, and left with approximately $5 million in cash and nearly $1 million in jewelry. It remains one of the largest cash robberies in American history. Gotti's role was peripheral. One of the men involved, a driver named Parnell Edwards, was supposed to bring the getaway vehicle to a salvage yard connected to Gotti after the robbery, where it would be quickly destroyed to eliminate evidence. Edwards chose instead to park the van near the yard and spend the night celebrating at his girlfriend's apartment. Police found the van within hours. The fingerprints inside it became a foundation for the subsequent investigation. Burke, in the months that followed the robbery, became consumed by the need to limit exposure. He killed a number of those involved in the heist to prevent them from talking, a series of murders that, along with the robbery itself, would eventually form part of the basis for Henry Hill's decision to turn government witness and for the story that became, years later, one of Martin Scorsese's most celebrated films. The second incident of that period involved a man named Thomas De Simone, the figure on whom the character of Tommy DeVito in that same film was loosely based. De Simone had spent the 1970s operating with Burke and Henry Hill while developing a reputation for volatility that had created serious problems for those around him, including the killing of a senior Gambino associate and, in 1974, the murder of a close associate of Gotti's named Ronald Gerothe, carried out as an act of personal vengeance after a dispute involving Gerothé's sister. By the late 1970s, the consensus within the relevant circles was that DeSimone had become a liability. In late 1978 or early January 1979, DeSimone disappeared. It is generally understood that he was killed on Gotti's orders. His body was never found. The winter of 1978 and 1979, viewed in retrospect, represents a kind of threshold. Gotti was now deeply embedded in the Gambino hierarchy, earning substantial money, respected and feared by those around him. He was also operating in a world where violence was both a tool and a consequence, where the relationships that sustained criminal enterprise were constantly under pressure, and where the wrong association or the wrong decision could unravel everything. He had not yet learned, or perhaps had no inclination to learn, what that meant for the long term. On the 18th of March, 1980, John Gotti's 12-year-old son Frank rode a motorized bicycle out of his driveway and onto a residential street near the family home. A neighbor's car, coming from the direction the child had not looked toward, struck him. Frank Gotti died from his injuries. A police investigation and a subsequent inquest reached the conclusion that Frank had moved into the street at speed without looking, and that his neighbor, John Favara, who had been driving at normal speed, bore no legal responsibility for what had happened. No charges were filed. What the law concluded and what the Gotti family felt were two entirely separate things. Victoria Gotti confronted Favara at his home when he came to express his condolences. The atmosphere in the neighborhood made clear that Favara's continued presence there was untenable. He began making arrangements to relocate his family. He did not move quickly enough. On the 28th of July, Favara was taken from near his workplace, bundled into a van, and never seen again. Gotti was in Florida at the time with his family and had an alibi when police made inquiries. Years later, accounts emerged suggesting that the killing had been carried out on Gotti's instructions and that the body had been disposed of in a manner that ensured it would not be recovered. Gotti would not speak publicly about the death of his son, nor about what had happened to Favara. There are those who have argued that Frank Gotti's death fundamentally altered something in his father, a grief that, unable to find a legitimate outlet, found other expressions. Whether that psychological interpretation is accurate or simply convenient is impossible to say with any certainty. What is clear is that the loss of Frank did not produce any observable change in direction. Within months, the business of the Bergen crew continued as before. The money kept moving. The operations kept running. Through the early 1980s, the tension between Gotti and Paul Castellano hardened from personal temperament into something structural. Castellano had built a 17-room mansion on Tot Hill in Staten Island, a residence whose scale and certain design elements reportedly evoked the White House. He conducted business from inside it, receiving visitors in his dressing gown, rarely leaving, directing affairs through a small circle of trusted intermediaries. Those who worked under him experienced him as remote and increasingly out of touch. Gotti was his opposite. He appeared in the neighborhoods his crew controlled, gambled heavily, and moved through the world with the energy of someone who had come from nothing and had no interest in behaving otherwise. People who worked under him described him as fierce, physically commanding, and difficult to predict when his patience was stretched. The central conflict was narcotics. Castellano had not prohibited the trade. It generated too much revenue, but had established a protocol. Made men of Gotti's rank were not to be personally involved. The handling of drugs was to be pushed down to the lowest levels of the organization, insulating senior members from prosecution. It was sound institutional reasoning, and Gotti's crew routinely ignored it. The consequences arrived in November 1981, when the FBI secured a court order to wiretap a telephone in Angelo Ruggiero's home. Ruggiero was one of Gotti's oldest associates. He was also, as the recordings that followed made clear, one of the least discreet figures in the history of the American mafia. Over the next 2 years, he discussed gambling, racketeering, loan sharking, and narcotics on the tapped line with remarkable openness. Those recordings became the basis for additional warrants, including, eventually, authorization to place a listening device inside Castellano's own residence on Tot Hill. By 1984 and 1985, the implications were filtering through. Castellano, now facing his own federal charges, demanded transcripts of the Ruggiero recordings from the family's underboss, Della Croce. Della Croce refused. Castellano signaled that he was considering restructuring the Gotti crew as a consequence, possibly demoting Gotti outright. The fault lines that had existed for years were now openly visible. Aniello Della Croce died on December 2, 1985. He was 71 years old and had been ill with cancer for some time. His death removed the one figure who had consistently served as a moderating force on Gotti's impulses, an old-school boss who, despite his own disagreements with Castellano, had held to the established rules of succession and had made clear that stability mattered more than personal ambition. Castellano did not attend the funeral. Within the world Gotti inhabited, this was not a minor slight. It was a statement, deliberate or carelessly made. The effect was the same, and in the days that followed, Castellano compounded the situation by announcing the promotion of Thomas Bilotti, a loyal associate, as his new underboss. There were also suggestions that with Della Croce gone, Castellano intended to break up the Gotti crew entirely. The response was organized within 2 weeks. Gotti brought the plan to a small group of the most trusted figures within his immediate circle. Permission from the Commission, the body that governed interfamily relations, and, in theory, any action of this magnitude was neither sought nor obtained. In the mafia's own framework, this was a serious violation. A boss could only be removed with the consent of those who governed the broader organization. Gotti did not ask, he acted. On the evening of December 16, 1985, on a busy block in Midtown Manhattan outside a well-known steakhouse, Paul Castellano and Thomas Bilotti were shot and killed. Gotti was in a car nearby. 2 weeks later, when the relevant figures within the Gambino hierarchy met to address the vacancy at the top of the organization, Gotti was confirmed as interim head of the family. The ratification came in January 1986. Whatever reservations may have existed about the manner in which the change had been made, no serious challenge to his ascension materialized. Frank DeSico, one of the men Gotti trusted most and who was appointed his underboss, was killed months later in a car bomb, an act of reprisal from those loyal to Castellano. Gotti moved through this without deviation, replacing DeSico with Joseph Armone, a veteran of the organization who had first become involved with the Gambino family in the 1930s. The new head of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the United States was 45 years old. He had not finished high school. He had spent most of the previous 15 years either in prison or under indictment. He dressed well, gambled heavily, and believed, apparently with considerable conviction, that he was smarter than the people trying to catch him. The years ahead would test that belief. The traditional mob boss in the post-Gambino era understood invisibility as a survival strategy. Castellano had taken this principle to an extreme, perhaps too far, but the logic behind it was sound. The attention of federal prosecutors was finite. An organization that kept its leadership off the front page was harder to dismantle than one that invited scrutiny. Gotti did the opposite. From the first weeks after Castellano's killing, the New York tabloid press had identified him as the likely architect of the murder and the probable successor at the top of the Gambino family. Rather than retreat, Gotti leaned into the attention. He dressed with evident care, well-tailored suits, tie precisely knotted, and was aware of cameras in a way that made clear the coverage was not unwelcome. He became, in the newspapers and on the evening news, a figure simultaneously dangerous and strangely compelling to a public that had developed, through the 1970s and 1980s, a considerable appetite for stories about organized crime. He also, in those years, kept beating criminal charges. In 1986, Gotti was indicted on racketeering. The case collapsed when it emerged that a juror had accepted a bribe of $60,000, and when his legal team effectively discredited the prosecution's witnesses as people who had made deals to avoid their own imprisonment. He was acquitted in March 1987. In 1989, he was arrested on charges connected to an assault he had ordered on a union official. As he sat in the police car after the arrest, he offered the officers 3-to-1 odds that he would beat the case. The charges expanded to 6 assault counts and conspiracy. He beat all of them in February 1990. The press dubbed him the Teflon Don. Each acquittal produced new coverage. Gotti emerged from courthouses in tailored suits, acknowledged the crowds, and played to the cameras. His ability to undermine juries through financial persuasion or more direct forms of pressure had become something prosecutors now factored explicitly into their planning. With each acquittal, the resources directed at him increased. The FBI's focus settled on the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, a venue Gotti had adopted as a regular meeting place from 1988. Agents planted listening devices at multiple points in the building. an upstairs apartment Gotti used for private conversations, a hallway, and near the bar. The recordings they gathered were extensive and, in time, decisive. In December 1990, the FBI moved. A raid on the Ravenite Social Club resulted in the arrest of Gotti, his underboss Salvatore Gravano, known as Sammy, and several others. The charges were, by any standard, serious: racketeering, conspiracy, multiple counts of murder. Gravano, in the weeks and months that followed, faced a decision. The evidence assembled against him was substantial. He was looking at convictions on charges that could mean the rest of his life in prison. He had, by this point, spent years at Gotti's side and had accumulated detailed knowledge of the organization's operations. Prosecutors made clear they were interested in what he had to say. What reportedly made up Gravano's mind were recordings from the Ravenite wiretaps in which Gotti, speaking to others in the upstairs apartment, was heard speaking disparagingly about Gravano, describing him in unflattering terms, attributing to him various problems that Gotti preferred to keep at a distance. When those recordings were played to Gravano by prosecutors, his decision was made. He agreed to testify. The trial began in Brooklyn in January 1992. From the outset, it proceeded in a way that was structurally different from the prosecutions Gotti had previously escaped. A judge ruled that the jury would be sequestered for the duration of the proceedings, housed away from the general public, under government protection, insulated from the kind of outside pressure that had affected previous juries. Gotti's longtime legal team was effectively removed from the case after prosecutors placed his own lawyers on the witness list, legally barring them from defending him. Several of the defense witnesses Gotti's new team had planned to call were also excluded from testifying. The prosecution's case, delivered over roughly 2.5 months, built systematically. Wiretapped conversations in which Gotti discussed criminal operations in explicit terms. Evidence of jury tampering in the 1987 racketeering trial. Detailed testimony from Gravano, who admitted his own involvement in more than a dozen killings, most of them ordered by Gotti, that described the hierarchy and operations of the Gambino family with the specificity of someone who had been at its center for years. Gotti's composure in the courtroom deteriorated as the proceedings continued. There were outbursts, there were interventions from his lawyers. The demeanor that had served him well in the press, confident, composed, slightly theatrical, did not translate well into a courtroom where the evidence was being laid out methodically and there was no audience to perform for in the same way. The jury deliberated for 14 hours and returned a verdict of guilty on all 13 counts. Among the convictions were multiple murders, including the killing of Paul Castellano. At his sentencing hearing in June 1992, John Gotti was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The United States Penitentiary at Marion, Illinois, had been built in the early 1960s as the intended successor to Alcatraz. After the killing of 2 prison guards in 1983, it had been redesignated as a maximum security facility operating under conditions of strict confinement. For Gotti, this meant 23 hours a day in a cell, the near-total absence of the social world that had sustained him throughout his adult life. For a time, he attempted to continue directing the family's affairs from prison. It became clear quickly that this was not sustainable. The other New York families communicated their view that he should formally step down. Gotti negotiated a compromise. He would retain the nominal title while his brother Peter and his son John Jr. managed day-to-day affairs from the outside. Portions of his phone conversations from those years have been made public. He complained with some frequency about the food, specifically the absence of prosciutto and mozzarella. He commented on the Clinton impeachment proceedings in 1998, observing that the outcome might have been different if the president carried an Italian surname. These were the remarks of a man whose world had shrunk to the dimensions of a cell. In 1996, he was assaulted by another inmate. He made efforts to have the matter dealt with. The inmate was transferred. In 1998, John Jr. was indicted on racketeering charges. Gotti urged his son not to cooperate. John Jr. negotiated a plea deal and received a 6.5-year sentence. Victoria communicated to her husband that she would consider separating from him if he did not make clear their son should leave criminal life behind after his release. He agreed. Also in 1998, Gotti was diagnosed with throat cancer. He had smoked heavily all his adult life. It was treated and he returned to Marion. It came back. In 2000, he was transferred to a federal medical center in Missouri, where the disease progressed. John Gotti died on June 10, 2002. He was 61 years old. His church in Brooklyn agreed to hold only a limited service. His body was placed in a family crypt. The organized crime presence at the funeral was sparse, a measure of how many of those who had worked alongside him were themselves in prison by then. The period following Gotti's conviction saw a sustained erosion of the Italian-American mafia's institutional power. The causes were multiple, but reducing the decline to a single factor would miss something important, and so would pretending that Gotti's tenure played no part in it. The prosecutorial wave of the 1980s continued into the 1990s, producing convictions at every level of the Gambino family and the other New York organizations. The RICO statute gave federal prosecutors a tool specifically designed to attack the structural integrity of criminal enterprises, and they used it with increasing effectiveness. By the mid-1990s, the proportion of senior Gambino figures who were not incarcerated had fallen sharply. The organization continued to operate in a diminished form. Acting heads came and went. Domenico Cefalù, a Sicilian-born figure, held the role for a period. More recently, a man known as Frankie Boy Cali served as acting boss before being killed in 2019, an event widely covered as evidence of how attenuated and fragmented the old structures had become. The broader landscape had also shifted in ways the old five-family framework was not designed to navigate. Cybercrime, transnational drug networks, and the expansion of other organized criminal groups, including Albanian networks with ties to the 'Ndrangheta of Calabria, had reshaped the American underworld in ways that Cosa Nostra, as constituted, simply did not adapt to. Anthony Casso, the Lucchese underboss who was himself convicted in 1993 and sentenced to what amounted to multiple consecutive life terms, said of Gotti's behavior in the 1980s that it marked the beginning of the end for the organization. Casso was not a neutral observer, and his statement carries that weight. But the structural point, that Gotti's decision to operate visibly, to court the press, to remove a boss without authorization, and to run his family with a flamboyance that guaranteed governmental scrutiny, was not without substance. John Gotti was buried in a crypt in Queens in June of 2002. The ceremony was modest, constrained by the church's discomfort and the reduced circumstances of those who might have attended in another time. He had been, by most objective measures, a destructive force for the people around him, for the organization he claimed to lead, and for those whose lives intersected with his in ways they had not sought or chosen. The story of his rise is also the story of how a particular kind of ambition, when it operates without constraint or accountability, will eventually consume the very structures that made it possible. He spent the final decade of his life in a cell with 23 hours of daily solitude. The world that had made him recognizable, the restaurants, the cameras, the courtroom theater, the crowds outside the courthouse, was entirely gone. What remained was a man in an Illinois prison, complaining about the absence of good Italian food, watching from a great distance as the family he had taken over collapsed around a series of federal prosecutions he had, in no small part, invited. Whether he understood this toward the end, whether the solitude produced anything that resembled reflection, is something no one can say with certainty. What can be said is that the New York he came from, the organization he rose through, and the era that made his particular kind of notoriety possible all belong now to the past. The world moved on. The mafia changed. And John Gotti remains precisely where that final chapter of his story left him, a figure from a very specific American moment, the kind of person that particular time and place made possible, and that the passing of that time and place made impossible again.